materials that tend to be criticals will be your technology metals, renewable sectors, the construction sectors, aerospace and defense, electronics, consumer products are usually the major sectors that are of importance.
Okay, then let's transition. So you said earlier that you work 60% on criticality and still try to keep 40% of your professional life in deep sea mining research. Can you just explain, I guess, start with where your expertise is and where that kind of started, how it came about?
So I have large expertise in geochemistry of mineral deposits and the interaction between their environment and how effectively the environment influence the formation, preservation of a deposit over the different geological timescales that we consider. So I've had the opportunity to work on nodules, massive sulfide deposits, as well as ferromanganese crust. And I've quite often looked at what we call the mineral system approach. Effectively, how do we define the parameters, geological, environmental, hydrothermal, temperature, pressure, and so on, that leads to the formation of a mineral deposit that you know will be of interest, and effectively how do you use those parameters to model prospectivity for different areas of the planet?
Yeah, explain that last piece, because that sounds like that's like, as you're explaining all of that, I think, okay, that sounds nerdy and I'm sure interesting to geologists, but kind of like, why do we care how these things formed? Don't we just care like what's actually there?
Well, effectively, a big part of the industry in the mineral sector is exploration. How do you drive exploration to find the deposit? A deposit is a geochemical anomaly within the background. So effectively, if you understand how the big mineral deposits that you know already about have formed, what are the environmental geological parameters that have led to their formation in this specific context, you can then start looking for similar patterns everywhere else. Yeah. And this is what guides at all the different levels, global level, and then more and more, as you get more and more higher resolution data sets, you can therefore lead to exploration. And for deep sea minerals, what's really interesting is that nodules are quite, I don't want to say easy to locate, but the question is, do they have the right composition? It's not because you found a nodule field that you will necessarily have the right metal balance to effectively make your extraction economically viable. Similar for sulfides, different geological environment, whether you are at a hotspot location where you are at a fast spreading ridge, a slow spreading ridge, an oceanic core complex, all those seafloor massive sulfides will have slightly different size and composition in metals. Ferromanganese crusts, they form from precipitation from seawater. Seawater is not an homogeneous reservoir of metals. It is stratified, it changes over time, has climate, weathering, and different oceanic basin opens and close. And therefore, crusts have often been used as an archive of evolving climate. But you can flip the script and say, what does our knowledge of past climate and local geology on the basin tells us about the potential for ferromanganese crust to contain the metals that we are the most interested in?
Yeah, okay, so cool. So that is, it's not only that you're going to identify the circumstances that are going to most likely have kind of valuable mineral deposits, but then at a higher resolution, getting some information, you're going to be able to fill in more of the gaps. And so a lot of this just comes down to the fact that we have a limited amount. I mean, with exploration everywhere, it's always difficult to get samples and data points, but I guess the more so in the deep sea. So what you're doing is trying to do more with less data.
Effectively, and in exploration, you have two strands depending on the amount of data you have. If you have a very low amount of data, we tend to do what we call expert-driven approach, whereby just the knowledge of the basic model of how that deposit formed pinpoints you the location you should be looking for. But you have a high rate of false positive in those instances, when you have a very large amount of data, you can start training machine learning and effectively get data-driven approaches with different versions of those algorithm that works well. Some that needs to be adapted. And effectively, what's really interesting is to see the difference between the two approaches, where potentially sometimes the geologists will provide critical information to say, well, the algorithm has pointed to this area as prospective. We know that we potentially are missing this factor into the model. We will disregard this area. But vice versa, sometimes the algorithm will point to an area that the geologists may have disregarded in the past and actually say, well, there is a statistic chance that is fairly high that effectively we've overlooked some parameters. And a model is a generalization. All models are useful, but they might be wrong as well. Incomplete, not adapted exactly to the general thing. So effectively, you need to look at that as well and potentially explore, why does the model, based on all the data that you've fed it, why is it pointing to this area whilst you've ignored it? And this is where new discovery can happen.
Okay, so then explain a little bit how long-term and climatological changes can feed into this. I just think I'm sort of imagining you see, okay, we now understand whatever this deposit was formed by this combination of surrounding geography and climate that led to whatever, I guess, runoff water with a good mineral content that led to precipitation, et cetera, et cetera. So does that mean that then you can kind of look and see, okay, in this other, whatever part of the globe, we can guess that millions of years ago there was this type of climate, and we can see, maybe there used to be a mountain range there that is now eroded, and that's what you're...
Effectively, so if you have a good sample set that allow you to derive the statistical relationships between those parameters, you can then generalize those rules and effectively create those exploration guidelines for saying, if you're really interested into, say, platinum and tellurium, we know that platinum and tellurium in ferromanganese crusts are much richer into the older part of the deposits. Because at that time, the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean at least, was less spread, so it was much closer. You had a much warmer climate at that time, back, say, 60 million years ago. And effectively, the weathering regime was much stronger. So all the big cratonic system from Africa, North America, South America were feeding a very different rate of materials through the river systems ending up into the oceans. We also had a different redox balance that therefore was precipitating more manganese versus more iron, which therefore attract different elements. So the balance is different. Very recently, in all the crust across the globe, we see that the last 3 to 5 million years of deposition are usually much more cobalt rich, because we've had the most intense circulation change on the planet with the creation of the bipolar circulation from Antarctic to Arctic, when effectively the Greenland, Scotland ridge opened up for the Arctic circulation, and we had the start of the deep water formation in the basin between Canada and Greenland. All that created a massive onset of very intense deep water overturn, deep oceanic oxygenation, major precipitation of iron manganese oxide, high cobalt content.
Wow.
So the research I try to lead and develop is effectively a high-level characterization of the relationship between those parameters. What is the influence of depth? If your deposit is forming very shallow versus towards the abyssal plain, how does the distribution within the water column of different species of animals, plankton, also influence the bioabsorbance of some metals? And how does that supply metals at different depths?
Jesus. You like to engage in topics with a lot of different factors combining.
Yeah.
I mean,
very data driven.
Yeah. It just sounds overwhelming when you just kind of throw in at the end, and then we're going to add the variable of species to also, give indication of the mineralogy. Which is great. That's something that I've heard a little bit of talk about recently, but wasn't so aware of, that there's this correlation between, I mean, it makes sense to me that depending on what's there in the geology, then that's going to influence what's there in the biology. And so that the biologists would be interested in learning some geology, but that it would go the other way also, that geologists are getting information from the biologists to put into their models about mineralization.
Absolutely. So this is a very well-known approach in terrestrial exploration because rocks form the basis for soil, and obviously different types of soil will influence the type of vegetation you have. So you see that in very densely covered areas. You can start mapping the underlying geology based on the type of trees that you have, whether they are more adapted to basic or alkaline or acidic soil. And then also you have some very specific plants that may grow only into those areas. And there's a famous example of a few diatrams, diamond location that have been found because a correlation between the growth of a flower with the rock of the diatrams was observed, and effectively people started looking for where that flower was present, started drilling, and is your next diamond mined. So effectively there is the similar correlation. It's a whole ecosystem environment that can lead you to further discovery through connex information. And this is where that kind of is similar to what I was talking about before, where you have the expert approach versus what the data is telling you. And sometimes you need data that comes from a completely different field to bring a new light onto your exploration.
The other thing that I wanted to follow up on that you mentioned was that, that I didn't realize, I never thought about this, that it could be that people are going looking for certain minerals. I guess I had just kind of assumed in the deep sea context that it's like, okay, here we find a deposit, and then we find out what minerals are there, and then we think about what the economics of those minerals are in this deposit. But you're suggesting that sometimes that goes the other way, that there's people who are looking for more of certain minerals, and then you're trying to pinpoint where those minerals might be in deep sea.
You could argue that for sulfide deposits, the big payers are going to be your chalcopyrite, your bornite, atacamite, which are the copper-rich minerals. But some hydrothermal system will only form pyrite. What is that? It's a big question. If you can find reasons as to what's leading the drive for a system to precipitate copper content, what is driving the copper content into the fluid, then you can already focus your exploration efforts on some areas rather than others. For ferromanganese crust, so for nodules, what is going to be the metal that you're going to be able to sell in the market is going to be driving what you explore for. Effectively, for instance, we know that depending on where the nodules are forming, depending on the processes that are involved into their precipitation, whether we are hydrogenetic dominant, so precipitation from seawater, or we are diagenetic, so a contribution from pore fluids into the sediments, you will have a different balance between, say, your cobalt versus your copper and your nickel. And effectively, at the moment, copper and nickel are what are the big payers for the mineral industry. Cobalt, we've touched on it earlier on, oversupplied, still useful for many industries, but it's not going to be what you're going to be able to sell your deposit on. So effectively, there is a drive. This is why the CCZ is currently a high interest exploration area, because there's a balance between those two. So you have a bit of a mixture between your copper, nickel, cobalt content, which allow you to minimize risk in exposure to markets change. But at the same time, you're not going for the purely diagenetic nodules of some other location, which are higher nickel, but at the moment, the ISA hasn't allowed any licenses in some of those areas, versus potentially some of the Cook Island nodules, which are going to be more hydrogenetic and therefore higher cobalt.
I want to ask you about how we make trade-offs in these sort of complex decision spaces. So it's interesting that you come at this question from so many perspectives, both that you have multiple expertises kind of in the deep sea case. You've been following the deep sea mining conversation for quite a long time, but then also you now have a very, I don't know if you would say, pseudo-political overview anyway. So you see how this ties into the societal. I feel like the deep sea mining conversation gets kind of characterized by there's these competing values, there's environmental risk, societal or economic value. So what values do you see are like mostly in play in the deep sea mining conversation? And do you think that there's any that are kind of like lacking or any that are overemphasized? I guess I'm interested in just a little bit your take on the tone of the deep sea mining conversation from like the question of what's important.
So what's really difficult is that effectively the ethics or morality of mining in the deep ocean brings in very strong emotional feedback, because the ocean, for the most part, is deeply linked to our connection with nature, as well as the fact that for a lot of the areas which are considered for potential deep sea mining, this is international seabed. So effectively, it's a decision that has to be taken by consensus, which is therefore a very complicated thing to do. On the morality of mining, it's an incredible topic whereby most of the mining industry very much struggle with what we call the social license to operate, because we quite often associate mining with environmental damage. But if it's not done into the right situation. But effectively, we are in a tendency where we're trying to shift away from hydrocarbons into a more green energy system, which rely on an improved efficiency and increased production of metals. So that begs the question of different causal loop, because we want to preserve the environment, but to do that, we need to mine. Mining has an impact on the environment. So is how do we manage that duality, and effectively, does the end justify the means?
Yeah.
And this is something where ethics around what do you put value on comes into play. Humans are part of the environment. We've been modeled by it. We use it as tools, as resources. So effectively, how do you extend that morality of human perception to an environment which is whatever it is? It can be the tundra, it can be the Arctic, it can be the deep ocean, it can be the rainforests. How do you value those environments is incredibly difficult to do. And as deep sea is a new frontier, a lot of people question the need for it. We know from a geological perspective that we do not lack mineral deposits across the planet. There are plenty of them. They're not just being exploited because the economy reality is not viable. And one of the driver, therefore, for deep sea mining or for the exploration of new frontier environment comes from the perceived legitimacy of production, requirements for fueling the energy transition, and effectively also the perspective that this transition can only be achieved through sovereign means. And effectively, this is where the dimension of criticality comes into the picture, because this is where you do not want to be dependent on foreign capital, on foreign investments and so on, and not be destabilized in your energy structure, in your manufacturing and so on. And therefore, the question of sovereignty brings another layer of morality. That is, does that trumps everything? Does the defense sector trumps everything else? Does the disproportion between those things is incredibly difficult to narrow down. There is no right or wrong answers. The question is, effectively, there are a lot of what we call the unknown in the deep ocean. There's lots of things we're still not sure about. The question is, do you want to rather leave that untouched and keep protected, although we know there's going to be an anthropogenic impact through everything that we do outside of the ocean? It's heating up, there's more ocean acidification. So is picking up metals from the deep ocean, creating an impact in the deep ocean or somewhere else, justifiable for deploying more globally the technology that allow us to reduce that environmental impact.
Very thoroughly framed this issue of being in a trade-off situation, which is something that I am supposed to be studying in my PhD project.
Perfect.
And how do we make decisions across diverse value categories? We can't easily make an equivalence between these two different value categories. So one of the things that you said is that sometimes there's some value categories that we may or may not give precedence to, or just kind of a trump aspect. Like some people will say sovereignty. Other people would say the same about pristine environment of the ocean. That's just a trump card. We're not going to go there. We can sort out sovereignty without that, and people are going to make the opposite decision. I sort of feel like we've been talking about this for the entire first half of the conversation, is how do you make decisions in trade-off situations? I mean, you've spent a lot of your career trying to apply various metrics together into decision frameworks. I wonder, just specifically on this question of how do you make decisions in complex trade-off situations, if you've got anything else to add.
I think effectively cost-benefit analysis is one way to have a look at that, but it has its own bias because you cannot ever characterize, quantify all the different aspects, even more so when there are well-known things we don't know. I don't think we can qualify the trade-offs. You can only take risk, measured risk, but whether a measured risk is really truly measured when you know there are things you don't know is the question. Also a perspective as to if you are a nation that you know you need to completely de-risk your supply, you need to find new sources of deposits, you're going to try and develop alternatives that fit that. Effectively, deep sea is one of those potential options. It doesn't mean it's the best one. There are lots of other alternatives. But if we tend to enter a geopolitical framework environment which forces actors to go and get those, then this will be justification. Whether it's the best one, probably not. The best course of action with regard to the deep ocean, from at least my perspective, would be to support industry in developing and testing without obviously allowing the doors open for exploitation. But effectively, potentially, let's do a thought experiment. What's the best? To leave us into not knowing, and effectively we may miss quite a few information about other things that can be useful, or effectively do a reliable testing, everybody agree on the parameters, we develop that framework so that we allow a large-scale test, we monitor it properly, and effectively we do evaluate right on the metrics that we all agree on of environmental impact, biodiversity. We take the time after the test to monitor recovery process, large-scale impact on connectivity. And then we take a more informed decision. Do we know enough? Yes, we allow it. Do we know enough? No. Then we develop the next stage of tests that is required to fill those gaps. And we may end up into a decision where we say, actually, we consider that we've minimized enough the risks. We can potentially let that industry develop. Or actually, we think it's not valuable enough and we have plenty of other alternatives that are not as damaging or destructive. And because it's an international area, we cannot find a consensus. That doesn't mean exploration and exploitation in economic zone owned by a state are not going to go ahead, because that's a different legislation though. But that would be the way forward.
Seems to me like you're doing your part in making whatever information systems available from multiple directions. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me here. Where would you send people to get information about about critical minerals? Do you guys have a website that you...
We do have a CMIC website. So if you search for UK Critical Mineral Intelligence Center, CMIC, you will very easily find it. Most of our reports and data sets are published on the website and accessible, free for download. So if they want information, they can go there, have a read about everything that we do. That's not just the criticality assessment. We have our inbox contact as well if there are open questions and want to get in touch.
Great.
Otherwise, any other reports from other people on criticality and those kind of questions are as valuable, but they present their perspective.
Okay. Pierre Josso, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Eric. It was a pleasure.